Welcome to Change Agents, a video series featuring stories of inspiration, leadership, and community building. We're joined today and very honored to have Madam Treaty Commissioner Mary Culbertson. Treaty Commissioner, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for asking me to be here.
Before we start, we want to acknowledge that Madam Commissioner and I reside on the traditional territory of the Cree, Saulteaux, Lakota, Dakota, and Métis Nation, Treaty 4 territory, the unceded lands of these Indigenous peoples, and we're all treaty people. I think the first question, Madam Commissioner, I read your bio and it talked about how you grew up on near Pelly, Saskatchewan, and on a family farm, but also close to your home nation. And you sort of use the language of two worlds. And you're a mother. I think you're a cookum to 6, if I recall correctly. And reconciliation, I think, takes many forms. And it really is reconciliation or reconciliation today that we're going to talk about. And so that's the purpose. It's the journey of reconciliation, how we can take practical steps to realize our collective ambition, to learn, to move forward together.
What is reconciliation? Well, we know that, of course, Truth and Reconciliation Commission produced 94 calls to action. And that took years and years of work. It took years of truth-telling from survivors of residential schools. And here where we are in the numbered treaties, there was a treaty promise to education. And it went completely awry. The treaty promise to education was not meant to be a vehicle for assimilation. And then we have the residential school system, which we still feel the effects of today. All the policies that came with that system that were created after that system in order to assimilate. Reconciliation is understanding the history, our shared history that makes up this country, that makes up this province. Even if it's ugly, we have to embrace that that's the truth. People want to gloss over the truth, but we can't do that if you really want to have reconciliation. And I always go back to this quote by Senator or former Commissioner Sinclair: education is what got us in this mess, and education is what's going to get us out. So I always go back to that. It's education. It's learning. And not education in a classroom sense alone. It's public education. And that public education can be just listening, reading, understanding, finding a place to ask a safe question. In Saskatchewan, we have 10 reconciliation-type conversations happening now in this province. 10. And I've seen those come up within the last 3 to 5 years. Especially in the last 3 years, I'm very proud to say I was able to see those things happen. And for us to be part of some of those conversations, most of them. And it just started by people who want to be good neighbors, who want to be good treaty partners, coming together to say, how do we do this? And it can't be one-sided. It has to be together, Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. I like to think of it in a huge global picture all the way down to at a community level. Canada stands on laurels across this globe that they are leaders in human rights, that they are leaders in democracy. They're leaders in foreign aid. But we have to look at where we are right now. Right? And it's not any one government's fat problem. It's an entire legacy that was started how long ago? From the very inception of colonization and all the roots to it. So we have not only a national responsibility, right, to walk the talk, but we have that personal responsibility because in your opening of our conversation, you referenced my bio where it says I kind of grew up seeing two worlds, and that's very true. Those two worlds, our farm north of Pelly, my Culbertson family owned that. They have a piece of paper that says that's theirs. And down the road, my mother's people, they have a reserve. So while my father's people were coming here from Ireland, Scotland, to build a new life, they were being given land. And at the same time, that land was being taken from my mother's people so they could have a new life. From there, they built property. They built wealth. They built things to leave to their children and grandchildren. What does my people have? We have a reserve that we can't pass property onto. We can't accumulate wealth because of systems that were put in place, racist systems. Those barriers that were created in those systems prevented us from participating in the economy, from being able to have a livelihood, from being able to accumulate property and wealth. And across the road from the reserve, you see thriving farms. You see thriving communities. So we have that personal obligation as people who get to live here because of treaty, in order to make sure that relationship our ancestors intended was supposed to remain. And that relationship was not one where you agree to the terms of this treaty and in 2 generations you're going to live in poverty. And in 5 years your people will be starving. All the buffalo will be gone. And you'll have almost no human rights. That was not the terms of treaty. But yet Canada was built on it. So as a nation, there's responsibility. As people who get to be here because of treaty, who get to accumulate wealth, who get to accumulate property, in order to live prosperous, we have that obligation to the people whose land this was built on. And that's our Indigenous people, our First Nations people. So we have a moral obligation as people on this land. We have a moral obligation as a country, as Canada. So not only those moral obligations, but in 20 years, we can't still be talking about racial divides. Yes, they'll probably be there. We can't be naive and say they're going to go away. But we had better do our best, because the way our demographics are changing. At what point is this going to be people of color all over this country, and the effects of colonization will be slowly going away, where we have non-Caucasian people being the larger demographic, where our food security issue is going to take us. We're all going to be looking for security. Look at COVID. It's brought people together in ways they can't understand, even though we're physically apart. But the virus is our greatest enemy right now, right? COVID-19. And everybody is looking for a way, for a solution. And then we all have that obligation that goes deeper, because we have those who don't have those benefits. So we have things that we have to access, like the food banks, like assistance programs, counseling, mental health, right? Schooling, all these things that we've always taken for granted in our fast-paced daily lives. Now we're all struggling to get through these things. So in 20 years, are we going to be talking about how we still have segments of our population completely cut off from the rest of the world benefits, or are we going to be talking about, remember when treaties still weren't honored? Remember when treaties still weren't fulfilled? Look how far we've come. And sometimes I feel like that, where I see the same things of 20, 30 years ago being said. And so I've thought about that. I don't want my grandchildren saying, "What were you doing?" So we have an obligation to our grandchildren. Right now, like I said, we have 10 reconciliation conversations going on across this province. Find out where your local one is. Go to our website, otc.ca. In Regina, you have a reconciliation group that was started some years ago. And you have a new mayor who's a woman. And of course, I'm very proud of that. I've congratulated her. And there'll be changes to how these conversations happen here. We have a huge group in Saskatoon that was, I think, probably the first conversation that ever happened. There's Lloydminster, Swift Current. There's places that have conversations you wouldn't think that are having a conversation. Nipawin, right, in Treaty 5 with their Treaty 5 bands there. Yorkton. Join a conversation happening near you. If there isn't a conversation, you can reach out to, maybe it's your local tribal council, and say, how can we work together to make things better, where our lives are going to be better for everybody, where we have the future to look forward to our children and grandchildren and them getting along. How do we do that? Join a conversation. If there isn't one, maybe we can help you find those agents of change in your community.
Yeah.
Because that's what reconciliation is. It's not waiting for the governments to do it. If we have to wait for government to tell us what to do, and we know that that doesn't happen here. People are very determined, and we all have a right to self-determination, and that includes the Indigenous people. So we can have those conversations, and sometimes they might be scary. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they might feel uncomfortable, but you know what? We're going to be okay. We're going to be okay after. And when people talk about racism and discrimination and hate, it's okay. You'll be okay after. It's uncomfortable, but that's when we know our body is telling us we have this reaction, a visceral reaction, that it doesn't like something. Maybe it doesn't like that conversation or how it makes you feel, so that means we have to change that. Right? From starting in here mm-hmm. to how we're thinking, from our heart to our head to doing. Food security can take on a few different forms. One of those forms is, of course, what we're talking about here today is food banks. Another aspect is hunting, fishing, trapping, and gathering. That was promised in the treaties. And that's impacted by the Natural Resource Transfer Agreement of 1930. We see today people aren't able to access lands to provide food for their communities. We have a system that created policies, that created laws, that inhibit people's right to feed themselves. When we have Indigenous people who live in urban centers, you're inherently coming from a background of poverty. I know that because I speak from personal experience. Just because my dad was a landowner, and at one time he was a very wealthy person, but that didn't always extend to us, especially when we moved back to our First Nation, and I was a little girl. So food security, when you leave the reserve as a young person and if you move to the city, it's a very different thing. Students, right? And lots of students, we don't have a lot of that privilege where you can go home to mom and dad's and they're doing your laundry and making your lunches. And I know that because I seen it in law school. I was a single parent of 4 kids in law school. And I had sports to manage, kids who needed things because they were going to school, and you want your kids to have those things other kids do. They were my priority. Keeping food in the fridge for them, between having a decision to make a car payment, those were the kind of decisions. Putting this power bill off because you have to put food in the fridge for your 4 teenagers who eat around the clock. And it wasn't just in law school that we had to have those hard decisions be done in our house. When I was a young parent and going to university in the city, I had to go to the food bank, right? And several times during my kids' young lives. One Christmas, that's all we had. was what we got from the food bank. And I didn't want to ask my parents, because you want to be able to stand on your own 2 feet.
Mm-hmm.
And probably my mom at the time wouldn't have been able to help me, right? She wouldn't have been able to. And that reality is there, and it's there today for families who are trying to get by on minimum wage, for young families, for Indigenous people living in urban areas. I know, for example, there's been a lot of our elected leaders in First Nations, they would do hunts and drop wild meat off at the food bank, right? And we've seen that a lot. And we still
see that. We're so grateful.
And I've been trying to help as much as we can as treaty commissioner with hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering issues. Whether it's people understanding what rights are, advising them on how to answer when they feel that they're being discriminated against because they're an Indigenous person, and there might be someone telling them you can't come on this land, or you don't have a right to hunt during this season or in this treaty territory. And we've seen that. People needing gas. Having money to put gas in your tank so you can go hunt, and finding a place to hunt, that's a barrier, that's an issue. So food security has taken all forms, from hunting right down to being able to provide for food banks, to donating to the food banks. When we're standing in line at a grocery store, and lots of times you'll see there's a donation option there, or to put dry goods into a bin, do that. You know, if we're able to do that, then we should be able to do that. If we can provide fresh produce, items for babies. You know, one of those times I had a newborn, and, you know, we were able to get diapers from the food bank. And we can't be ashamed of those things that have gotten to us to where we are, because it's life experience. Mm-hmm. It's those experiences that shaped us and who we are. And it's part of reconciliation, is being good neighbors, because our treaty ancestors wanted us to do that.
You know, we like to say at the food bank that we're neighbors feeding neighbors. You know, it's really important that we think of it that way. Madam Commissioner, I can't tell you how honored we are that you agreed to visit with us today, to educate us, to encourage us to have courageous conversations. We are so well served in Saskatchewan by the fact that you are our treaty commissioner, your unique perspective, but I think also your internal optimism. I know I felt really motivated meeting you before this interview and during this interview. I know our viewers well as well. And on behalf of our clients, our staff, our volunteers, all of our partners, all of us that work and live in Treaty 4, thank you. Thank you for being a change agent to you and your team, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for the work you're doing, and I believe agents of change are the ones who are going to be able to move us forward together.